welcome to the Beef Edge, the Teagasc Beef Podcast, for all your latest news, information and advice for Irish beef farmers. I'm Catherine Egan, and in preparation for winter, in a 3-part podcast series, I'll be focusing on the topics nutrition, health and housing. And in the third part of the series, I'm joined by vet and UCD lecturer Catherine McAloon to find out how to manage animal housing over the winter period. Catherine, farmers can have the nutrition of the animal correct and the animal treated to have them healthy, and yet still not be achieving 0.6 of a kilo per head per day over the winter period on weanlings. Why is that?
Yeah, I suppose that's an interesting one, and there's really, I suppose, a whole host of factors that could play into that. Husbandry factors, maybe things like feed space, housing issues and housing stresses that might put undue impact on the animals, and that reduces performance, but also things like feed quality, feed amount, feed access. And then obviously you have your animal health factors, and there's quite a long list. I suppose pneumonia and parasites will be the kind of classical ones, but they're probably the kind of main headline ones that we'd need to consider.
And in relation to the housing and space allowance that you mentioned, what is a typical bay of a slatted shed? How many weanlings or stores or cows should that house?
I suppose it depends on how the shed is designed. In terms of kind of smaller cattle weanlings, in terms of, under that 275 kilo mark, kind of growing weanlings, that kind of thing. I think the current Teagasc guidelines are, they should have at least 1.5 meters squared per animal in terms of a slatted house. And then for the older cattle, you're probably looking at, 2 to 2.5 meters squared per animal. So it really just depends on the shed and the width of the bay. And, you can calculate that very easily, just the floor space divided by 1.5 for young cattle, or divided by 2.5 for cattle over 275 kilos, and it'll tell you how many you can hold safely.
And obviously, as stock are growing over the winter, how often would that need to be altered or reassessed?
I think it probably would be sensible, I suppose, to try and design it now for what they're so that they have a bit more space at the start, and that they that rather than having to move groups, which wouldn't be an ideal thing for disease control and bullying and so on as the winter progresses. So I suppose, you'd maybe be thinking that those kind of growing cattle are maybe going to be in 70 to 100 kilos, depending on the length of the winter period, certainly targeting your space requirement for what they'll be, in 70 kilos time, and working backwards from there.
Catherine, feed barrier spacing is often something that's overlooked. What should farmers consider now that cattle are housed?
Yeah, I think this is a huge one, particularly in kind of, store growing weanlings and kind of growing cattle. Competition for feed, as well as the size of the animal and how they're fed, actually can have quite a significant impact on the performance that they achieve across the winter period. So, for example, if they're very tightly stocked and we're not feeding them ad libitum, then, there's restricted feeding, they're only maybe being fed at certain times of the day and so on, then that competition can really have a negative impact. So I guess really looking at just trying to have, a minimum feed space for the type of animal you're dealing with. So for those weanling type cattle, an absolute minimum of 0.3 meters. If they're on ad lib feed, that probably needs to be increased to about 0.5 meters per head if they're on restricted feed. And then for the older cattle, maybe kind of something very similar for the lighter store cattle up to the year-old. And as you come towards finishing cattle, then that space would need to be significantly increased, probably something like 0.5 meter per head with ad lib, increasing that to 0.65, 0.7 meters per head if it's restricted feed.
That's great. And I suppose good ventilation is also critical. And we often see some sheds that maybe there is an issue, even though we would think that there was a lot of air coming in. How does good ventilation work for it to be effective?
Good ventilation is sort of paramount in terms of, controlling the environmental risk that feeds into pneumonia problems, which are, also common in those kind of cohorts of both weanlings and growing cattle and store cattle. So I suppose there's two kind of key components to ventilation. There's what we call the stack effect, where, animals produce lots of heat, and as that hot air rises, then, it goes out through the highest point in the roof, that of course, if there is an outlet to allow it out, and it draws cooler air in through the inlet, and it creates kind of a constant flow of fresh air. And the second, I suppose, aspect to natural ventilation that we rely on in sheds is what we call the wind effect, where the wind will hit the shed at a certain angle and really allowing it to kind of blow through the shed, but not at animal level, which would create draft. So I suppose ventilation is a difficult thing to get right, and it can be difficult to go retrofitting sheds and so on, but it's really about having fresh air so that the bugs that the animals are constantly breathing out and so on are drawn out of the shed, and there's a real constant supply of fresh air, but without draft. So it's not an easy thing to get right. There's many things that we can do to assess it. So the size of the outlet is probably one of the most limiting things. The inlet is also important, although somewhat maybe easier to address than outlet. The pitch of the roof, the height of the eaves, the proximity of the shed to other sheds will all have an impact on ventilation. And of course, some of those things are easier to change than others. So I suppose if we have issues with pneumonia, looking to maximise our ventilation and at least have a good look at what it's like. Could it be improved upon? And if there is things like lots of cobwebs and staining drip lines on purlins, that kind of thing, then that might indicate that there is kind of condensation buildup and maybe ventilation isn't as good as it should be, and possibly something that could be addressed.
And you mentioned, Catherine, there drafts, and in some cases they're just as bad, if not worse, than poor air movement and stuffy conditions in a shed. What can farmers do to assess sheds or to avoid drafts?
So I suppose in terms of a draft, I suppose is very much about kind of our eyes and ears and our feeling ourself. That's kind of very subjective. Probably particularly if the shed needs to house young cattle as well as weanlings, then those getting to sort of standing at animal level and trying to see can you feel a draft on your head or your face, and it's about trying to really tackle those. So looking at trying to control areas of inappropriate airspeed, because that will obviously have a role in the natural immune defenses of the respiratory system. So if an animal is in constant draft, then they're much more likely to suffer issues with pneumonia. It's probably particularly important in those kind of younger calves, maybe drop calves, that kind of thing, but across all kind of age cohorts. I guess it's looking at kind of the site of the inlet to a shed, that it's not inappropriately low, and also things like looking at the cladding for the shed, that it's not allowing excessive draft, but probably more practical things like the internal pen dividers, maybe the use of stock boarding, that kind of thing could tackle drafty areas. Fixing rubber flaps that are on doors or gates that allow draft under gates, under doors into sheds, those kind of things might tackle and reduce draft. So it's a bit subjective, but certainly trying to reduce draft potential is an important one in the environmental controls of pneumonia.
Most definitely, Catherine. And checking water troughs is probably something that goes without saying, and the quantity of the pressure. But what issues can arise in relation to water in sheds over the winter period?
Yeah, I think this one is sort of very often overlooked and hugely important, kind of whether we're talking about young calves, drop calves on milk, right the way up to finishing stock. And obviously it's a huge issue. So firstly, ensuring an adequate supply of clean water is key. And that's actually hugely important in those calves coming up to weaning, because if we have suckler calves pre-weaning, or even if we're feeding drop calves, those kind of the water intake actually will have a huge role in how much starter they'll take, and how well the animal processes that starter and how well their rumen develops. So it's a really key component, but also right through to finishing cattle, again, it has a role in feed conversion and so on. So ensuring that there's enough of it, there's clean supply, adequate water pressure, those things are hugely important. But also on the other flip side of that is the siting of the troughs, anything we can do to make sure they're slightly off the ground to try and prevent the soiling, and not allowing kind of leaky drinkers to continue, because particularly in maybe in weanling pens, or even again if you're feeding any drop calves, then water is just adding more moisture to the shed, which again will have a role in pneumonia, and it's a particular problem in the younger calf cohort actually. So really trying to reduce those water leaks and control the moisture levels should have some good returns.
And calving, Catherine, will start on some farms from January onwards. What advice have you for housing cows pre and post calving?
I guess that's an interesting one. I suppose there's a time now, if it's a slightly quieter time of year, to kind of get things in order and get prepared, and I suppose that's key. I guess hopefully at this day of the year, the sheds are all already washed and disinfected. If they're not, then they certainly should be. And, particularly if farms have had issue with things like cryptosporidium and so on, the calving pen is often overlooked. So a really thorough clean first, so ideally power washing, and then only when cleaned, applying a proper disinfectant. So there's actually a very small number of disinfectants actually that are active against crypto. So making sure that you've, sourced the proper one of those, and, having the calving pen disinfected, up to maybe a meter and a half in height, as well as the fixtures and fittings, would be something that I would consider doing, as well as any kind of calf accommodation, and, given that time to dry. So that's probably one of the, important tasks. The other thing, I suppose, is thinking about space requirements and where you plan to calve, if you have enough boxes and so on. And again, enough space for those weanling animals, if you want to maximize performance. Then, of course, we can take the opportunity to fix those water troughs, block draughts, get gates working properly, which obviously would be hugely important, for the safety element if we're dealing with suckler cows, that kind of thing. So I suppose an NCT really, or of the winter accommodation before the calving really kicks off, I think would be a good opportunity now to take the time to get the preparation right.
Most definitely, Catherine. And for farmers that may be purchasing calves next spring, what should they be considering in relation to calf housing?
Yeah, I think this is a huge one. I guess the very fact of purchasing calves, which is just a nature of the industry, is it can't be avoided, but that is an inherent stress on the animal, particularly young animals that are like drop calves and calves that are going to be reared artificially on milk. That's a huge stress, leaving the farm of origin, the transport, possibly spending time in a sale facility and so on. So there's some of those things are not controllable, but there are issues. There are some controllable things that we can do when we get them to the farm. So making sure that we're only buying those healthy calves, with offering them electrolytes on arrival, that kind of thing. But probably in relation specifically to housing, probably the biggest thing we could do is look at stocking rate in terms of really measure the floor space of the pen. And ideally those young calves would have an absolute minimum of 1.5 meters squared, but ideally 2 meters squared per calf. So I would first look at what space I have and measure the area of that pen and divide by 2. And that'll tell me, how many calves I can adequately hold. And I certainly wouldn't overstock those pens. So I think about knowing what space we have and only stocking to that maximal stocking rate and not the reverse, I suppose, measuring once we have the calves in. I think ideally would be a good starting point to think, because overstocking is probably a huge driver for a lot of issues that we see. And then other things like, looking at, is there any way, often if we're buying calves, the systems maybe aren't purposely designed. So looking at where we can improve things like drainage, reduce draft, improve natural ventilation, like wind ventilation, because those young calves, particularly crossbred or dairy breed calves, just certainly won't drive enough or generate enough body heat for a successful stack effect. So we kind of have to rely on other aspects of natural ventilation. So looking at, do we actually have outlet? Is the inlet at the right level, but not causing a draft, those kind of things. And then also, I suppose, thinking about how we're going to feed those calves. What's the system you're going to implement? Are you going to be using a milk bar? Or, is there auto feeders in the shed, that kind of thing? If not, if we are looking at manual feeding systems, ensuring there's a hot water source, there's plenty of equipment, there's, facility for cleaning and disinfection of milk buckets and that kind of thing.
You've covered a huge amount of tips and advice, Catherine, and from your experience dealing with issues on farms, and in this case, a lot of stock are housed maybe on farms at this stage, what 3 things should farmers be looking at today on their farms to identify an issue before it arises?
Yeah, I suppose it would be hard to narrow it down to 3, but I guess space is probably one of the biggest ones, whether we're talking about, suckler weanlings or we're talking about, young dairy calves that are bought for rearing. So floor space is huge. So not overstocking, because that's probably one of the huge issues that we would see across the board with things like respiratory disease. So again, looking at what space you have and what's the maximal stocking rate for that type of animal in the facilities on the farm, as opposed to, trying to back calculate after, we've stocked it and so on. So looking at our space requirements is probably one. Looking at, what we can do to improve the environmental risk factors. So things like, reducing draft, improving ventilation. Ventilation is rarely perfect, but, there are things, simple things we can do. Maybe it is about letting more air in, or maybe it's just about closing draft, particularly at animal level, particularly for those young calves. So I would say space, ventilation and, reducing draft and improving drainage would probably be the big ones for the young calves, as well as, thinking about how you're going to keep them warm. So, plenty of straw on all the rest of it. So that's probably particularly for the young calves. And for the older calves, I think the same things apply, particularly around space requirements so that they're not overstocked, making sure that, ventilation is as good as it possibly can be for reducing those environmental risk factors, and also looking at things like draft.
Thanks a million, Catherine. Some great tips and advice.
Thanks for having me.
That's all for this week's episode, and my thanks to Catherine for joining me on the show. You can catch up on all other shows and interviews from the Beef Edge podcast on the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie, or you can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe so you never miss a show. For all other updates from our beef programme, keep an eye on our Twitter and Facebook pages. Until next time, I'm Catherine Egan, and thanks for listening.